No one remembered when the lamps at Dino's place had gone dark. Some said it was 5 winters ago. Others swore it had been longer. Time moved strangely in that part of the territory, where the hills rose bare and stubborn, and the wind carried rumors farther than truth. What everyone agreed on was this: the house on the hill had not shown a light in years. Not a candle, not a lantern, not even the dull glow of a banked fire. It sat above the valley, like a closed eye. Dino lived there alone, 30 years old, and already worn thin by living. His ranch had once been meant for horses, good horses, strong-boned and quick, but neglect had a way of creeping in when a man stopped caring whether morning came or not. Fence rails leaned at tired angles. The barn roof sagged under old snow. A handful of horses still lingered, half wild now, ribs showing through winter coats, coming and going as they pleased. Dino did not name them anymore. He rose before dawn out of habit, not hope. He split wood, mended tack, and checked the animals without speaking a word. Some days he did not hear his own voice at all. Other days he wished he could forget what it sounded like. Once he had been a dangerous man. Gold theft had paid better than honest labor, especially if you knew how to disappear into the hills before the law caught your scent. Dino had been good at that, too good. He'd learned to read the land the way other men read scripture, learned which creeks hid footprints and which rocks shattered a man's trail into nothing. Then he'd met his wife. She had laughed too easily for a man like him, trusted too freely. When she told him she was carrying a child, something in Dino cracked open that he hadn't known was there. He tried to leave the old life behind, tried being careful, tried being clean. It hadn't been enough. She died in childbirth, on a cold night much like this one, the baby following her into Watson's before dawn ever saw. Dino buried them himself beneath a cottonwood at the edge of the hill. After that, the world narrowed to chores and shadows. He stopped lighting lamps because there was no one left who needed to find their way home. The house stayed dark, and the people in the valley learned to avert their eyes. That night, the storm came in fast. Snow drove sideways, cutting the air like ground glass. The wind found every crack in the walls and worried at them, howling as if it meant to tear the place apart piece by piece. Dino sat at the rough-hewn table with his coat still on, a cup of cold coffee untouched in front of him. The fire had burned low. He hadn't bothered feeding it. Then he heard it. Not the wind, not the horses shifting outside. A knock. It was so soft at first that he thought he'd imagined a still sound swallowed by the storm. He held his breath, listening. The knock came again, clearer this time. 3 raps. Careful, uncertain. No one knocked on his door. Dino stood slowly, his chair scraping the floor. His hand went to the old revolver by habit, though he didn't lift it. He crossed the room and pulled the door open a few inches. The cold rushed in, sharp enough to steal breath. On the porch stood a little girl, no more than 7 years old. Snow clung to her hair and eyelashes. Her coat was too thin for weather like this, and her boots were soaked through, leaving dark crescents on the warped boards. She held her hands together tight at her chest, as if bracing herself against more than the cold. She looked up at him without crying. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice steady but small. "I didn't think anyone lived here." Dino stared at her, stunned by the simple fact of her being there. A child, alone, at his door. "What are you doing out in this storm?" he asked. His voice came out rough, unused. "My mama," the girl said. "She's hurt." Something in her eyes, a sharpness, a knowing that didn't belong to someone so young, cut through him. "Where is she?" The girl swallowed. "Down the slope." She fell. "The snow keeps covering her." Dino hesitated. In that pause lived every reason to turn away. The law, the past, The certainty that anyone connected to him ended up worse for it. The house had stayed dark for a reason. The girl shifted on her feet, the cold finally beginning to reach her bones. "Please," she said. Not begging, just stating a fact. "She's got a baby in her belly." Dino closed his eyes. Then he turned back into the house. He moved as if afraid he'd change his mind, crossing to the wall where an old lantern hung unused, its glass clouded with dust. His hands shook as he poured oil into it. He struck a match. The flame flared, small and defiant, and for a moment, he simply watched it burn. Light spilled onto the porch for the first time in years. The girl blinked, startled by the sudden glow. Dino pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders. "What's your name?" "Linda." "All right, Linda," he said, lifting the lantern. "Show me." They stepped into the storm together. The wind fought them every step of the way, snow rising to Dino's knees as they moved down the hill. Linda led without hesitation, her small boots finding a path he wouldn't have seen. Near a stand of scrub juniper, she stopped and pointed. "There." Dino dropped to his knees, brushing snow away with bare hands. Beneath it lay a woman, curled on her side, one arm wrapped protectively around her swollen belly. Her face was pale, lips tinged blue. When Dino touched her shoulder, her eyes fluttered open. "Please," she whispered, "my baby." "That's all right," he said, though he didn't know if it was true. "I've got you." He lifted her carefully, feeling how light she was, how shallow her breathing had become. Linda followed close behind, as he carried the woman back toward the hill, the lantern swinging and throwing long, trembling shadows across the snow. Behind them, the storm raged on. Ahead of them, for the first time in a very long while, a light waited. By the time Dino reached the house, his arms were burning and his lungs felt packed with ice. The woman lay limp against his chest, her breath shallow and uneven. Each one a small sound he listened for like it might be the last. Snow clung to her skirts and hair, melting into his coat and soaking through to the bone. Linda ran ahead and pushed the door open. Warmth thin, but real spilled out from the dying fire. Dino crossed the threshold and shut the storm behind them. For a moment, he simply stood there, holding the woman, as if unsure where to put a living thing in a house that had forgotten how to hold one. "Here," Linda said, already dragging a chair out of the way. "Mama can lay on the bed." Dino nodded and carried the woman into the back room. The bed was narrow and rough, its blanket old and threadbare, but it was dry. He eased her down carefully, keeping one arm beneath her shoulders until he was sure she wasn't slipping away. Her hand twitched, fingers tightening briefly in the fabric of his coat. "Stay," she murmured. "Please." "I'm not going anywhere," he said, surprised to hear the certainty in his own voice. He moved fast then, the way he used to when trouble found him in the hills. He fed the fire until it caught properly, filled a kettle from the pump, and set it to heat. From a battered crate beneath the table, he pulled out his small collection of dried herbs, things he'd learned to use when there was no doctor within a day's ride. He crushed a handful between his fingers, breathing in the sharp, earthy scent. Behind him, Linda hovered close, eyes tracking every movement. "She's cold," the girl said, "and her breathing's wrong." "I know," Dino replied. He knelt beside the bed and pressed 2 fingers gently against the woman's wrist. Her pulse fluttered, quick and weak. "What's your mama's name?" "Hermaine." "Hermaine," he said softly, leaning closer. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened a fraction. "My husband." Her voice broke, and she shook her head, as if the rest of the sentence was too heavy to carry. "We'll talk later," Dino said. "Right now, you need to rest." He wrapped her in blankets and placed a warmed stone near her feet. Her shivering eased a little, but the tightness in her face did not. One hand stayed pressed to her belly, thumb moving in slow, worried circles. Dino turned to Linda. I need to get some water in her. Warm, not hot. Linda nodded once. There's a plant by the creek, she said. Mama showed me. The leaves long and soft. You boil them and drink it slow. It helps. Dino hesitated. He knew the plant she meant. He'd used it once, years ago, for a miner who'd taken a bad fall. You sure? Yes, Linda said. There was no doubt in her voice. I'll make it. She climbed onto a stool by the stove, hands steady as she dropped the leaves into the kettle. Dino watched her work, something twisting in his chest. She moved with purpose, like someone who had learned early that panic didn't help. When the water was ready, Linda poured it into a tin cup and held it with both hands. Dino helped lift Hermaine's head. Small sips, he said. Hermaine drank obediently, eyes closing again when the cup was empty. Within minutes, the strain in her breathing eased, the lines in her brow smoothing just a little. Exhaustion claimed her, and she slipped into sleep. Linda sat down on the floor beside the bed, knees drawn up to her chest. She didn't take her eyes off her mother. You should sleep, Dino said quietly. There's time now. Linda shook her head. If she wakes up and I'm not here, she won't be alone, he said. I'll be right here. The girl considered this, then leaned her head back against the bed frame, eyes still open. Just for a minute, she said. The storm battered the walls through the night. Wind moaned in the eaves. Snow piled higher against the door. Dino kept the fire going, feeding it with careful hands. He checked Hermaine's breathing every few minutes, counting each rise and fall of her chest. Linda never fully slept. When her eyes closed, they fluttered open again almost at once. Once, when Hermaine stirred and murmured in her sleep, Linda was on her feet in an instant, reaching for her mother's hand. She's all right, Dino said gently. Linda nodded but didn't sit back down. Near dawn, the storm began to weaken. The wind lost its edge, the snow falling straighter, wetter. Gray light crept through the small window, revealing the room in full. The cracked walls, the patched blankets. The man and the child keeping watch over a woman who breathed more easily now. Hermaine woke with a start, eyes wide and unfocused. Where? You're safe, Dino said. You're in my house. She took in the room, then Linda's face, then her own hand resting on her belly. Her breath caught. The baby? Still there, Linda said quickly, and moving. Tears slid down Hermaine's cheeks. Thank God. She looked at Dino then, really looked at him. You brought us here. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I don't even know your name. Dino. She nodded, committing it to memory. You saved us. He shook his head. The storm hasn't decided that yet. Hermaine managed a small smile. Still, thank you. Later, when she was stronger, she told him the rest. How she, her husband, and Linda had been traveling alone, hoping to reach a place where they might start over. How the dogs had come first, how the snow had followed, how her husband had turned back to draw danger away from them. He told me to keep going, she said, voice trembling, to protect the children. Dino listened without interruption. When she finished, he said only, he did right by you. Silence settled between them, heavy but not unkind. You can stay, Dino said at last. Until the baby comes, until you're ready to go. Hermaine's eyes filled again. I won't be a burden. You won't, he said, and you'll help if you can. That's enough. Linda reached for his hand without thinking. He froze for a heartbeat, then let his fingers close gently around hers. Outside, the snow lay thick and quiet, covering the tracks of the night. Inside, the lamps stayed lit. Morning came thin and pale, The kind of light that didn't warm so much as remind you the night had finally loosened its grip. Frost feathered the inside edges of the window, and the house smelled of wood smoke, boiled herbs, and damp wool drying near the fire. Dino had not slept. He sat at the small table with his coat still on, a tin cup cooling between his hands. Every so often he glanced toward the back room, listening for the sound of breathing, steady now, slower than it had been. Each time he heard it, something in his chest eased just a fraction. Linda stirred first. She had fallen asleep sitting upright against the bed frame sometime before dawn, her head tipped forward, braids slipping loose. When she woke, she straightened at once, eyes snapping to her mother. "Mama?" she whispered. Hermione turned her head slightly. "I'm here," she said, her voice hoarse but present. "You stayed up all night." Linda nodded, as if that were the most natural thing in the world. "You needed me." Dino watched the exchange from the doorway. He'd seen tough men bleed out on cold rock without a sound, but there was something about that simple sentence that hit him harder than any of it. He cleared his throat. "You hungry?" Linda considered this, then shook her head. "Mama needs to eat first." "I can manage," Hermione said. She pushed herself up a little, wincing. Dino was there in 2 steps, steadying her with a hand at her shoulder. "Slow," he said. "You took a hard fall." She nodded, catching her breath. "Linda told me about the tea." "Thank you." "She told me," Dino corrected gently. Hermione smiled faintly and looked at her daughter. "You remembered." Linda shrugged. "You always said remembering is the same as helping." Dino turned back to the stove, busying himself with cornmeal and dried beans. It had been a long time since he'd cooked for anyone but himself. He measured by instinct, poured water until it felt right, stirred until the smell filled the room. They ate quietly. Hermione took small bites, one hand resting on her belly. Linda sat close, watching her mother's face with a seriousness that belonged to someone twice her age. When the bowls were empty, Dino set them aside. "I'm going to check the horses," he said. "I won't be far." Linda nodded. "I'll stay with Mama." Outside, the world was hushed under fresh snow. The storm had passed, leaving the land scrubbed clean and aching with cold. Dino moved through the corral, checking fences, breaking ice in the troughs. The horses watched him warily, their breath steaming in the air. For the first time in years, he noticed how quiet it was, without the wind screaming at his ears. Quiet enough to hear his own thoughts, which he didn't much care for. When he came back inside, Linda was kneeling by the hearth, adding a stick to the fire the way he'd shown her. She looked up, proud. "I didn't let it go out." "I see that," Dino said. "Good job." Hermione was sitting up now, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Color had returned to her cheeks, though she still looked worn thin. "I don't know how we'll ever repay you," she said. Dino shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." She studied him for a moment. "People don't usually help strangers like this." "People usually don't knock on my door," he replied. A hint of a smile crossed her face, then faded. "My husband would have thanked you himself if he were here." Dino swallowed. "You said he stayed behind." "Yes," she said softly. "The dogs came out of nowhere. He told me to take Linda and keep moving. I didn't want to leave him." Her fingers tightened in the blanket, but he wouldn't let go of my hand until I promised. Silence filled the room. Linda slipped her hand into her mother's. "He was brave," Dino said at last. "That matters." Hermione nodded, tears slipping free despite her effort to hold them back. Linda leaned against her, offering quiet comfort. The days that followed settled into a careful rhythm. Dino repaired what he could around the house. He widened the narrow doorway to the back room, so Hermione wouldn't have to turn sideways to pass through. When the hammer slipped and caught his foot, he bit back a curse and laughed at himself. The sound rusty but real. Linda made herself useful, wherever she could. She fed the chickens, swept the floor, and followed Dino like a shadow when he worked the fence, asking questions about everything from horse tack to the shape of clouds. Once, he found her perched on the barn roof, legs swinging. "Linda," he shouted, "get down from there." "I just wanted to see how far you can see," she called back cheerfully. She slipped on the way down and landed in a pile of straw, sending the horses skittering in alarm. Linda emerged laughing, straw in her hair, completely unhurt. Her mane scolded her between relieved breaths. Dino shook his head, unable to hide his smile. At night, the lamps stayed lit. It felt strange at first, the glow filling rooms that had long known only shadow. Dino found himself waking in the dark, startled by the sight of light, heart racing as if he'd been caught doing something wrong. Each time he forced himself to breathe and let the moment pass. One evening, as snow began to fall again, lighter this time, Dino found Linda sitting at the table, tracing shapes in a patch of spilled flour. "What are you making?" he asked. "A map," she said, "so Mama knows where we are." Dino crouched beside her. "You already know where you are." She looked up at him, serious. "Sometimes people forget." The words stayed with him long after she'd gone to bed. That night, her mane woke with a sharp intake of breath. Linda was at her side instantly, calling Dino's name. He came running, heart pounding. But it passed quickly, a false alarm. Just the baby shifting. Still, the fear lingered. Later, when the house was quiet again, Dino sat at the table and stared at the lantern. He remembered the years he'd kept it dark, convinced that light was a promise he couldn't keep. Now, a woman and a child slept under his roof. Another life waited to be born. Linda had stayed awake when it mattered most. So had he. Outside, the horses shifted in their stalls. Inside, the fire crackled low and steady. Dino reached out and turned the wick just a little higher, letting the light grow. For the first time since he could remember, he didn't feel like turning it down again. Winter loosened its hold a little at a time, never all at once. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, leaving behind dark patches of earth that steamed faintly in the weak sun. The nights were still hard and cold, but the days carried a promise Dino hadn't felt in years. Her mane grew stronger with each passing morning. She insisted on helping, even when Dino told her to rest. She swept the floors slowly, stopping when her back tightened. She mended torn shirts by the window, needle flashing in the thin light. She cooked when she could, favoring simple meals that stretched what little they had. Beans simmered with onion, bread baked flat and warm on the hearthstone. "I don't want to just take," she said one afternoon, pausing to catch her breath. "I need to earn my keep." "You already are," Dino replied, "by staying alive." She smiled at that, though her eyes searched his face as if weighing the truth of it. Linda flourished. The ranch gave her space to run, things to climb, animals to watch. She learned the horses' moods quickly, which ones would shy and which would tolerate her small hand on their necks. She asked Dino endless questions, most of them thoughtful, some of them impossible. Why do hills never look the same from far away? Do horses dream? Did my papa ever come this way? Dino answered what he could and admitted when he didn't know. He found he liked the sound of his own voice better when it was answering her. One afternoon, while Dino worked on a new bed frame for Hermione and Linda, the hammer slipped and caught his foot square. He sucked in a sharp breath and hopped backward, swearing under his breath. Linda clapped a hand over her mouth. "I'm sorry, did I distract you?" He waved her off, grinning through the pain. "If that's the worst thing that happens today, I'll count myself lucky." Hermione shook her head from the doorway. "You should be more careful." "Hard habit to learn at my age," he said. That evening, Linda climbed onto the roof again, chasing a breeze that smelled faintly of thawing earth. This time she slipped for real, tumbling off the edge and landing in the hay pile below with a muffled thump. The horses scattered, snorting and stamping. Dino's heart stopped. He ran, ready for the worst, only to find Linda sitting upright, laughing so hard she could barely breathe. "I flew," she declared. Her mane pulled her into a fierce hug, scolding between tears. Dino turned away, to hide the way his hands were shaking. As the weeks passed, something unspoken settled among them. Dino found himself listening for their footsteps when he returned from the fields. He caught her mane watching him sometimes, her expression thoughtful, as if she were seeing him not as the man he had been, but as the man he was trying to be on. One evening after supper, she spoke. "My husband," she said quietly, hands folded in her lap. "He believed in starting over." Dino looked up from the table. "Most people do. They just don't always get the chance." "He would have liked this place," she said. "The quiet, the way the sky feels bigger." Dino nodded. "He sounds like a good man." "He was," she said. "And so are you." The words hung between them, gentle but heavy. Dino didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low. "I wasn't always." She met his gaze steadily. "Neither was I, in some ways. We're here now. That counts." He wanted to believe her. The baby grew restless as spring edged closer. Her mane's nights were broken by discomfort and dreams she couldn't quite remember upon waking. Linda slept curled against her, one arm draped protectively across her mother's belly, as if she could shield the child within by sheer will. Dino prepared as best he could. He repaired the wagon, checked the path to town, counted supplies. He made sure the lanterns were filled and ready. The thought of what was coming sat in his chest like a stone. One night, rain swept in from the west, pounding the roof and turning the yard to mud. Thunder rolled across the hills, distant, but insistent. Her mane cried out. Dino was at her side in an instant. "It's time," she said through clenched teeth. He saddled the horse without thinking, rain soaking him through as he rode hard for town. The road was slick, the darkness thick, but he pushed the horse on, every fear he'd buried clawing its way back. By the time they returned with the midwife, her mane was exhausted and pale. Linda stood her ground at her mother's side, refusing to leave. The hours blurred together, pain, prayer, whispered encouragement. Dino waited outside the room, counting his steps. He had faced men with guns and storms that could kill a man outright, but nothing had ever made him feel so helpless. Then, at last, the sound came. A cry. Strong, alive. Dino sagged against the wall, breath shuddering out of him. The midwife emerged smiling. "A boy," she said. "Healthy as they come." Linda burst into tears, laughing through them. Her mane held the child close, eyes shining with wonder and relief. For a moment, the world felt right. That feeling did not last long once they went into town. People stared. Whispers followed. Words like improper and shameful drifted through the air. Some said Dino was raising another man's family. Others spoke worse of her mane, their voices sharp with judgment. Dino bore it in silence, jaw set. Her mane kept her chin high, but the hurt showed in her eyes. Then Linda stepped forward. "That's not true," she said, her voice clear and steady. "My papa died protecting us. Dino saved us. That's all there is." The street fell quiet. One by one, eyes dropped. Apologies came, halting and awkward. Bread and milk appeared at the door the next day. Then eggs, then a blanket. The village elder offered Linda a place in the schoolhouse. That night, as the lamps glowed warm and steady, Dino watched her mane rock the baby by the fire, Linda leaning close. The house felt full in a way it never had before. 3 lives under one roof. And for the first time, Dino allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, that was exactly how it was meant to be. The first weeks after the baby's birth passed in a blur of sleepless nights and small, necessary miracles. The boy was strong, loud when hungry, quiet only when held close against his mother's chest. Dino had not known what to do with an infant, but he learned quickly how to warm bottles, how to pace the floor in the dark when nothing else would settle him, how to recognize the different cries. Hermione watched him with a mixture of gratitude and something softer, something she never named. Linda took her new role seriously. She announced herself the baby's protector, hovering close whenever anyone else held him, correcting Dino when she thought he was rocking too fast or too slow. "He likes it better when you walk," she told him, "not stand." Dino obeyed without complaint. For a while, the ranch felt like it existed outside the rest of the world. Snow melted into mud, mud dried into rutted earth. Grass pushed through where winter had pressed hardest. Dino repaired fences and began training the horses again, coaxing them back into usefulness, with patience he hadn't known he possessed. But they could not stay hidden forever. Supplies ran low. The baby needed cloth, soap, and medicine. Hermione needed things the ranch could not provide it. So one clear morning, Dino hitched the wagon and headed toward town with Hermione beside him, and Linda perched between them, the baby wrapped tight in a blanket. They felt it before they heard it. The looks, the sudden hush as they passed, conversations lowering into whispers that followed like shadows. "Isn't that him? He's the one on the hill. That woman's got nerve." Hermione kept her eyes forward, back straight, despite the ache that lingered from childbirth. Dino held the reins tight, jaw set. Linda's small body stiffened. At the general store, the cylinders pressed in thick as dust. Dino paid without argument. He did not look at anyone longer than necessary. Outside, a man Dino recognized stepped forward, arms crossed. "That boy," he said, nodding toward the bundle. "He yours?" Dino answered evenly. "He's under my roof." The man snorted. "Looks white enough to me." Hermione's breath caught. Linda's hands balled into fists. Dino leaned forward, voice low. "You best mind your business." The man held his ground for a moment longer, then stepped back, muttering. The ride home was quiet. At the ranch, Hermione finally spoke. "They'll never stop talking, will they?" Dino didn't answer right away. "People talk when they don't understand something," he said at last. "Sometimes they talk because it's easier than being kind." Linda looked up at him. "They're wrong." "Yes," he said. "They are." The weeks that followed tested them. Every trip to town brought the same murmurs, the same sideways glances. Some people offered kindness quietly, slipping eggs or bread into Hermione's hands when no one was watching. Others made sure their disapproval was seen. Dino felt the old anger stir, sharp and dangerous. The part of him that had once answered insult with violence stretched awake, restless. But every time he felt it rise, he looked at the house on the hill, at the lamp glowing in the window, at Linda's laughter drifting out into the yard, at Hermione standing in the doorway with the baby on her hip. And he chose differently. One afternoon, a group gathered outside the store as Dino loaded supplies. Voices rose. Accusations flew. Hermione stood frozen, the baby fussing against her shoulder. Then Linda stepped forward. She was small, barely reaching the grown folks' elbows, but her voice carried. "My papa died so we could live," she said loud and clear. "Dino saved us, when no one else would. That doesn't make him bad. That makes him brave." The words cut clean through the noise. No one spoke for a long moment. A woman wiped her eyes. The man who had questioned Dino earlier looked away. Later that evening, someone knocked on the door of the house on the hill. Then another. "Bread," goat's milk, a sack of flour. Awkward apologies, spoken and unspoken. The village elder came himself the next day. He cleared his throat and spoke plainly. The girls got sense. We could use that in the schoolhouse. Hermaine's eyes filled. Linda stood tall, pride shining on her face. That night, Dino sat alone on the porch after the others had gone to sleep. The lamp burned steady beside him. He stared out across the land, thinking of the man he'd been, the man he was becoming. For the first time, the weight of other people's words felt lighter than the weight of his own choices. And that, he realized, made all the difference. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came the way healing did, slow, uncertain, and easily missed if you weren't paying attention. The first sign was the sound. Water, moving again. Dino heard it early one morning while repairing a gate at the edge of the pasture. The creek that had lain silent under ice all winter was running again, thin but determined, cutting a narrow path through mud and stone. He stood there longer than necessary, listening, his hammer forgotten in his hand. Life insisting. The ranch followed suit. Grass pushed up between the fence posts. The horses filled out, coats shedding in dull clouds that drifted across the yard. Dino began taking them out again, riding the perimeter, fixing what winter had broken. He worked harder than ever, not out of punishment this time, but out of care. Inside the house, the days found their own rhythm. Her mane grew stronger, her color returning, her movements as sure again. She cooked more now, filling the rooms with the smell of stew and fresh bread. She sang softly while she worked, songs her husband had loved, songs Linda knew by heart. The baby Tomas, they named him, thrived. He slept better at night, his cries fewer and farther between. Dino learned how to hold him just right, one large hand steady against the small warm weight of him. Each time Thomas wrapped his fingers around Dino's thumb, something inside Dino loosened, just a little more. Linda started school. She walked into town each morning with her head high, books hugged tight against her chest. At night, she came home full of stories, of letters learned, of sums solved, of questions asked that no one else had thought to ask. Dino listened from his chair by the fire, pretending not to be proud, failing badly one evening. As the sun sank low and painted the hills gold, Hermione joined Dino on the porch. They sat in silence, listening to the horses shift in the corral, to Linda's laughter drifting from the yard where she chased fireflies. "You didn't have to do any of this," Hermione said at last. "You could have sent us on our way." Dino kept his eyes on the horizon. "I know." "Why didn't you?" He considered the question carefully. "Because the night you knocked on my door, I realized something. I'd been living like the world had ended, but it hadn't. I just stopped answering when it called." Hermione nodded slowly. "And now I answer." She reached out, her hand resting lightly over his. He did not pull away. Summer came warm and generous. Travelers began stopping by the ranch again, drawn by the sight of a steady light on the hill and the promise of water and rest. Dino offered what he could: coffee, a meal, a place to sleep in the barn. He asked few questions. Most folks didn't ask him any either. The house no longer felt too small. One night, after the others had gone to bed, Dino stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the lantern on the table. He remembered the years he'd kept it dark, convinced that light was something he no longer deserved. Now, he knew better. He lit it, not because he was afraid of the dark, but because someone might need to find their way. Later that week, Dino rode into town alone. He went to the sheriff's office, dismounted, and stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and old paper. The sheriff looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "I know who you are," the man said carefully. Dino nodded. "I reckon you do." They talked a long while. about the past, about debts owed, about time served in silence. When Dino walked back out into the sunlight, he felt lighter than he had in years. Some things, it turned out, could be faced head-on. That evening, as stars pricked the sky one by one, Linda climbed onto the porch rail beside him. "You okay?" she asked. He smiled. "I am." She held up the lantern. "I like this one best." "Why's that?" "Because it stays on," she said simply. Dino laughed, the sound easy and unburdened. Hermione watched from the doorway, Thomas asleep against her shoulder, her eyes warm and knowing. They stood together as night settled around them, not empty, not threatening, but full. Full of breath and laughter, and the steady glow of a home that had chosen to live again. Long after the valley below went dark, the light on the hill remained. Not because it had to, but because now someone always lit it. And so the light on the hill never went dark again. Not because the night was gone, but because hope had learned where it belonged. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment so I can keep bringing you even more meaningful stories. Thank you all so much for listening.